I don't want you standing there in that suit a minute longer than you have to, so pack a bag and get out of my house tonight. That's what my daughter-in-law said to me at my wife's wake, in front of 40 people holding paper cups of coffee. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I set my cup down on the mantel, next to the photo of Margaret from our wedding day, and I walked upstairs and packed one suitcase. The next afternoon, a sheriff's deputy knocked on that same front door and asked her to step outside. My name is Walter Kessing. I'm 66 years old, and before I tell you what happened on that porch, you need to understand the 11 months that led up to it, because none of it was an accident, and none of it was luck. It was my wife, protecting me from beyond the grave, in a way I never saw coming. I bought the house on Larkspur Court in Springfield, Missouri, back in 1987. I was 27, working nights at the rail yard, and Margaret was 3 months pregnant with our son Ethan. We didn't have two dimes to rub together, but we had that house, a narrow two-story with a crooked chimney, and a yard big enough for a garden. Margaret planted rose bushes along the back fence the first spring we lived there, and every year after that, no matter what else was going on in our lives, those roses came back. I built a workshop out back myself, board by board, on weekends, over the course of 2 years. We raised Ethan in that house. We watched him ride a bike down that street, watched him leave for the army at 18, watched him come home 4 years later, a little quieter, a little older, but still our boy. Margaret and I grew old together in that house. 37 years of marriage, and I never once imagined a single day of it without her sitting across from me at the kitchen table. But 8 months ago, the cancer that had been sleeping in her for who knows how long woke up fast and mean, and by the time the doctors found it, there wasn't much they could do except make her comfortable. She died in March, in our bedroom, with Ethan holding one hand and me holding the other. I won't pretend the grief since then has been anything less than the hardest thing I've ever carried. Ethan had married a woman named Renee about 2 years before Margaret passed. Renee was 31, worked in property management for some big firm downtown, always dressed sharp, always had an opinion about how things should be done. When Margaret got sick, Renee and Ethan moved into the house with us, into the two spare rooms upstairs, supposedly to help take care of her, and to help take care of me once Margaret was gone. I was grateful. I told myself it was a blessing to have family close during the worst season of my life. I didn't understand yet that Renee had been doing arithmetic in her head from the very first week she carried a suitcase through that front door. It started small, the way these things always seem to. Within a month of moving in, Renee had gone through Margaret's craft room, the little back bedroom where my wife kept her sewing machine and her quilting fabric, and turned it into what she called a home office, boxing up 30 years of Margaret's projects and stacking them in the garage without asking either of us first. I let it go. Margaret was too sick by then to fight about curtains and boxes, and I didn't have the strength left over to fight either. Ethan worked long shifts as a claims adjuster and came home each night looking more tired than the night before, caught between a wife who wanted things her way and a father who was quietly falling apart. I noticed my son laughing less. I noticed him going quiet at dinner, nodding along instead of talking the way he used to. I never said a word against Renee to him directly, not once, because I could see how much he was already carrying. But I noticed things. I noticed how she asked, more than once, in that light, breezy voice of hers, whether the house was still just in my name, or if Ethan's name had ever been added to the deed after Margaret and I got older. I told myself I was an old man, imagining things. I told myself my son had found somebody who loved him, and that ought to be enough for me. I was wrong to let that thought sit unchallenged as long as I did, but grief has a way of making a man too tired to trust his own gut. About 6 weeks before Margaret passed, on a Sunday afternoon while Renee had taken the car to visit her sister 2 towns over, Ethan came and found me out in the workshop. He looked like he hadn't slept right in days. He sat down on the old stool across from my workbench, the same stool he'd sat on as a boy watching me sand down birdhouses, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope, thick with paper, and told me to put it somewhere Renee would never think to look. I asked him what in the world was going on. He said, "Dad, I need you to trust me on this, and I need you to not open it unless something happens to me or Mom or both of us at once. Just trust me." I laughed, a little uneasy, told him he was scaring me for no reason, that nothing was going to happen to a 34-year-old man in good health. He didn't laugh back. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he came home from his second tour. Something tired and afraid and resolved all at the same time. I took that envelope without opening it and locked it inside the old fireproof safe in my closet. The same safe where Margaret kept our marriage license and Ethan's birth certificate and every important paper we'd collected across 4 decades. I didn't press him for more that day because he had the look of a man who'd already made peace with a hard decision, and I trusted him completely. Looking back now, I wonder how long he'd already known what Renee was capable of, and how long he'd been quietly building a wall around me without ever saying so out loud. That envelope sat untouched in the dark of that safe for 6 weeks. Through the last of Margaret's illness, through her funeral, through the long gray months after. And I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had left in this world. Margaret's funeral was held on a rainy Thursday morning at the Little Methodist Church on Grand Avenue, the same church we'd been married in 37 years earlier. Nearly 90 people came. Her sisters flew in from Tulsa. Old neighbors who'd known her since the Reagan administration stood in the back pews with tissues balled up in their fists. I stood at the front of that church and shook more hands than I could count, and every single one of them said some version of the same thing, that Margaret was the kindest woman they'd ever known, that the world was dimmer without her in it. I believed every word of it, because it was true. After the burial, family and close friends came back to the house for the reception, the same tradition Margaret and I had followed for every funeral we'd ever attended together. I was sitting in my recliner in the front room, still in the black suit I'd worn to bury my wife of 37 years, when Renee came and crouched down next to my chair with a paper plate of food she made no move to actually hand me. The room was full, maybe 35 or 40 people standing around with coffee cups and quiet conversation, the low hum of grief filling every corner. She leaned in close to my ear, and in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest handful of guests to catch every word, she said, "I don't want you standing there in that suit a minute longer than you have to, so pack a bag and get out of my house tonight." The room went dead silent. I saw my neighbor of 22 years, a retired fire captain named Gerald Ashby, freeze with his coffee halfway to his mouth. I saw Margaret's younger sister, Donna, put a hand over her own chest like she'd been struck. Every person in that room heard what my daughter-in-law said to me. On the day I buried my wife, standing in the house I'd built with my own 2 hands nearly 40 years before. I didn't shout. I didn't argue with her in front of people who just watched me lower Margaret into the ground. I looked at Renee for a long moment, and something in me went very still, the way a pond goes still and glassy right before the first frost sets in. I thought about Ethan, about the envelope locked in that safe, about the 6 weeks I'd spent trusting my son without asking a single question. I thought about 37 years with Margaret in that house, about the rose bushes she'd planted along the back fence and the workshop I'd built board by board. Then I looked at Renee, and I smiled, a real and steady smile, and I said, "All right then." That was the whole of it, 2 words. The room stayed frozen another few seconds before people slowly, awkwardly, went back to their conversations, unsure of what exactly they'd just watched happen to a grieving old man in his own living room. I stood up, walked upstairs, and packed one suitcase. I didn't need much. A few changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, a photograph of Margaret and Ethan from a 4th of July picnic years back, and the fireproof safe from my closet with Ethan's envelope still locked inside. I came back downstairs 15 minutes later, suitcase in one hand, safe tucked under my other arm, and walked straight past Renee toward the front door without a single word. She looked almost let down that I hadn't fought her on it, like she'd been hoping for tears, for begging, for something to talk about at church the following Sunday. I gave her nothing at all. I stepped out into the cold rain, and I walked 4 houses down the street without once looking back. Behind me, I could hear the low, confused murmur of my late wife's mourners, wondering what exactly they'd just witnessed happen to an old man on the worst day of his life. Gerald Ashby had lived 2 doors down from us for over 20 years. He'd retired from the fire department 6 years back and spent most of his days now fixing up an old truck in his driveway or tending a garden that put mine to shame. He'd been at the funeral that morning, and he'd heard every word Renee said in that living room. When he opened his front door and found me standing on his porch, soaked through, suitcase in one hand and a metal box under the other arm, he didn't ask me a single question. He just stepped back and said, "Get in out of that rain, Walter." His wife, Peggy, had the guest room made up before I even finished my second cup of coffee at their kitchen table. Gerald sat down across from me, slid a mug my way, and asked, plain and quiet, You want to tell me what happened back there? So I told him everything. The 30-day version Renee never actually gave me a number for. The way she'd said it loud enough for half the room to hear, the way her face had looked almost pleased delivering that news to a man who'd buried his wife 6 hours earlier. Gerald shook his head slow, his jaw working with anger on my behalf. That's your house, Walter, he said. Been in your name since before Ethan was even born. She's got no more right to that place than the mailman does. I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that safe, sitting on the floor next to my chair, on the envelope Ethan had handed me with hands that weren't quite steady. That night, after Gerald and Peggy had gone up to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small reading lamp, and I finally opened it. Inside were three things that changed the whole shape of what I understood about my own family. The first was a copy of the deed to my house, confirming exactly what Gerald had already told me, that the property had never once been transferred out of my name. Not to Ethan, not to Renee, not to anyone. The second was a life insurance policy Ethan had taken out through his employer 4 years earlier, worth $420,000. 2 months before Margaret died, Ethan had quietly changed the primary beneficiary on that policy from Renee to me. The third item was a letter, handwritten, 6 pages long, in Ethan's own, careful hand. In it, he explained that he'd discovered, almost by accident, that Renee had been draining a savings account they'd told me was for a future house of their own, and had run up nearly $70,000 in credit card debt across 3 cards I'd never known existed. He wrote that he believed she was positioning herself to push me out of the house once Margaret passed, so she could either sell it outright or refinance it and cash out the equity, and that he'd been quietly gathering proof for a divorce he hadn't yet found the courage to file. He asked me to forgive him for carrying this alone instead of telling me sooner, and he asked me, in his own words, to protect myself, no matter what it looked like from the outside, no matter how it might seem to anyone watching. I read that letter 3 times at Gerald's kitchen table, tears running steady down my face, grief mixed up now with something else entirely, something that felt almost like clarity cutting through a fog I'd been standing in for months. My son had seen this coming before I ever let myself see it. My son had spent what turned out to be some of his final months of peace, quietly building a fence around his father, without ever once making me carry the weight of knowing why. 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, while I was still staying with Gerald and Peggy, tragedy found our family again. Ethan was driving back from a late shift downtown on a Tuesday night when a delivery truck lost its brakes coming down the hill on Chestnut Street and crossed the center line before he had any chance to react. He was gone before the ambulance made it to the hospital. I remember Gerald's phone ringing at 11 at night, and I remember the sound Peggy made when she answered it and heard Renee's voice on the other end. I had already lost my wife of 37 years 4 months earlier. Now I had lost my only son too, and some nights since then I still can't tell you how I managed to stand up out of that kitchen chair at all. The funeral for Ethan was smaller than his mother's had been, held at the same little church on Grand Avenue, but the grief in that room was somehow heavier, thicker, the kind that presses down on your chest and doesn't ease up. Renee stood beside the casket in black, accepting condolences, playing the part of the young widow with the same practiced ease she'd shown everything else. I stood a few feet away, numb clean through, shaking hands with people who didn't quite know what to say to a man who'd buried his wife and his only child within the same season. I hadn't yet told a single soul about the envelope, about what I already knew was sitting inside that safe back at Gerald's house. The morning after Ethan's funeral, while I was still at Gerald's kitchen table nursing coffee I couldn't taste, Ruth Delgado called. Ruth had lived across the street from us on Larkspur Court for almost 15 years, ever since her and her husband bought the little brick rancher after their youngest went off to college. She told Gerald she'd watched a moving truck pull into my driveway that same morning, less than 18 hours after we'd buried Ethan, and that a real estate agent's car had followed it in not long after. The agent, a woman named Carla Whitfield, had planted a small sign by the mailbox that read, "Coming soon," with a photograph of my house already printed on it. Renee was moving to sell my home less than a day after burying her husband, and less than 3 weeks after telling me to get out of it at my own wife's wake. What she had no way of knowing was that Ethan's letter had already told me exactly where to look, and exactly what I'd find once I did. That same morning, I called an old friend of Margaret's family, a real estate attorney named Howard Bricks, who'd been practicing in Springfield for over 30 years and had handled our own house paperwork back when Ethan was still in diapers. I told him everything, start to finish. The funeral, the thing Renee said in front of 40 people, the envelope, the moving truck already sitting in my driveway less than a day after my son's burial. Howard told me to sit tight, and within a couple of hours he called back with news that turned my stomach clean over. He'd pulled the county recorder's records that morning and found a quitclaim deed filed just 4 days earlier, supposedly signed by Ethan, transferring full ownership of my house from me directly to Renee. The trouble was, according to the notary stamp on that filing, the document had been signed and witnessed on a day when Ethan's own employer's time cards showed him working a full 12-hour shift 60 miles away at a satellite claims office in Joplin. Howard didn't waste a minute once he found that discrepancy. He'd been doing this work long enough to know exactly what he was looking at: a forged deed, backdated and notarized under false pretenses to make it look airtight to anyone who didn't check the details. He tracked down the notary's license number listed on the filing and discovered the woman named on it, a Springfield notary named Diane Foss, had no record whatsoever of ever notarizing a single document for Ethan Kessing. Not on that date, not on any other. Howard suspected, and later had it confirmed, that Renee had paid Diane, a former coworker of hers from a property management job years back, to forge the notary seal using an old stamp Diane still had lying around from a previous job she hadn't properly surrendered. Howard sat me down and explained, plain and direct, that this had stopped being a family disagreement the moment that quitclaim deed hit the county records. This was deed fraud and forgery, two serious felonies under Missouri law, both of them carrying real prison time for the people responsible. Then he asked me one simple question. Walter, do you want to handle this quiet, keep it inside the family, or do you want to report it and let the law sort it out? I thought about Ethan, about the 6 pages in his own handwriting, about how hard my son had worked, in what turned out to be his final weeks, to build a wall between his father and a woman who'd already decided our grief was nothing but an opening. I thought about Renee crouched next to my recliner, smiling as she told me to pack a bag on the day I buried my wife. I looked Howard dead in the eye and said, report every bit of it. Howard filed a formal complaint with the Greene County Recorder's Fraud Division that same afternoon, attaching copies of the forged deed, Diane Foss's notary records, and Ethan's letter as supporting documentation. By 4 o'clock, the case had already been forwarded to the Springfield Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The detective assigned was a 22-year veteran named Detective Carol Whitmore, who'd built her whole career around fraud and forgery cases just like this one. Howard met with her that same evening and walked her through the entire timeline. Margaret's death, Ethan's death 3 weeks later, the eviction demand made in front of dozens of witnesses at a funeral reception, and a forged deed filed while Ethan was still very much alive and 60 miles away punching a time clock. Detective Whitmore pulled Ethan's actual employment records that night, confirming beyond any doubt that he'd been working in Joplin on the exact date the deed claimed he'd signed it in Springfield. She reached out to the real estate agent, Carla Whitfield, who had no idea whatsoever that the property she was preparing to list carried a fraudulent ownership claim. Carla, wanting nothing to do with a fraud case, pulled the coming soon sign from my yard within the hour and canceled every bit of the listing paperwork. Detective Whitmore told Howard that between the forged notary stamp, the impossible timeline, and Ethan's handwritten letter all lining up together, she had more than enough to seek a warrant. She also mentioned that Renee had already attempted to file an early claim against Ethan's life insurance policy, listing herself as the sole beneficiary, apparently unaware the beneficiary had been quietly changed to me 2 months earlier. That attempted claim alone had already raised red flags inside the insurance company's own fraud department, who'd started an internal review before the police had even gotten fully involved. 2 mornings later, exactly as Detective Whitmore had planned it, a Springfield police cruiser pulled into the driveway of my house on Larkspur Court at 7:15 in the morning. Ruth Delgado told Gerald afterward that Renee answered the door still in her bathrobe, hair a mess, clearly caught off guard. Detective Whitmore identified herself and told Renee she was investigating a filed complaint of deed fraud and forgery connected to the property, and that she had a number of questions regarding a notarized document filed with the county recorder's office. According to Ruth, Renee's face went the color of chalk standing there in that doorway. She tried to explain that Ethan had signed the paperwork before he died. Detective Whitmore calmly informed her that Ethan's own employer's time cards placed him 60 miles away, doing a full shift on the exact date in question. Renee was brought in for formal questioning that same day, alongside Diane Foss, the notary who'd forged the seal. Within the week, both women were formally charged. Renee with deed fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud. Diane with forgery and notary misconduct. The forged deed was voided the moment the fraud was confirmed by the county recorder, restoring full and clear ownership of the house back to my name, exactly where it had legally belonged the entire time. Renee was ordered to vacate the property within 14 days, while the criminal case moved forward. The very house she'd told me to get out of at my own wife's wake, with no timeline at all, except immediate. Gerald told me later that when the moving truck finally showed up for her, not one single neighbor came out to help her carry a box. Ruth stood on her own front porch across the street the whole time, arms crossed, making sure Renee didn't try to walk off with anything that wasn't hers to take. I moved back into the house on Larkspur Court on a cold, clear afternoon in early December, almost exactly 2 months after I'd walked out into the rain with one suitcase and a metal box under my arm. Gerald and Peggy helped me carry boxes back inside, and Ruth brought over a pot roast that evening, the same quiet, unasked for kindness that Street had always been known for. The house felt different walking back through that front door, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with square footage, and it always will. But it also felt like mine again, fully and completely, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in months. I found Margaret's sewing machine still boxed up out in the garage, where Renee had shoved it back in March, and I carried it inside myself and set it back up in the little back bedroom where it had always belonged, right where my wife would have wanted it. Renee eventually took a plea deal on the fraud and forgery charges, avoiding the maximum sentence, but still walking away with 18 months behind bars, a permanent felony record, and a court order to repay every dollar of legal fees tied to the false property claim. Diane Foss lost her notary license for good and served probation of her own. Renee never once tried to reach me again, and I never went looking for her either. There wasn't anything left between us worth saying. Some evenings I still sit in that recliner in the front room. The same chair I was sitting in the afternoon, she leaned down and told me to pack my bags in front of 40 grieving neighbors and friends. I think about Margaret out there in the garden every spring when those roses come back along the fence line, and I think about Ethan, about how even while he was quietly carrying his own fear, even while he still had weeks of ordinary life left that none of us knew were numbered, my son found a way to protect his father one last time before he ever knew for certain it would be needed. That envelope in my closet safe wasn't just paperwork. It was the last gift my boy ever gave me, wrapped up and waiting months before either of us understood the shape it would eventually take. I lost my wife and I lost my only son within the same terrible year, and no amount of justice ever brings a single day of that back. But I got to keep this house we built our whole life inside of. And more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who my son really was, right up until the very last thing he ever did for me.